Hello, welcome back to Masterpieces of British Literature 1. I'm Dr. Long, Mr. Dr. Long, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to three characters from Geoffrey Chaucer's general prologue of his Canterbury Tales. Three characters, the knight, the knight's son or the squire, and the prioress. And what I want to do is read the descriptive section from the general prologue and of each of these, and then give some general observations about that character. It's why this poem is so powerful, is how acutely Chaucer zeroes in on these really amazing details. And in my explanation, I want to go a little bit deeper into why he was choosing the categories of description he was. Okay? So bear with me, and I'm going to get started. The first is the knight, pronounced the knicht in Middle English. And this is his description, lines 43 through 78 in your textbook or in the general prologue of the poem, and you can follow along. Please also, if you want, download the script from the homepage, your course homepage, and you can read along with my script as well. I'm going to begin with the knight's description. A knicht there was, and that a worthy man, that from the time that he first began to reading out, he loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy. Full worthy was he in his lord's wear, and thereto had he reden no man fair, as well in Christendom as Hethenesse, and ever honoured for his worthiness. At Alessandra he was, when it was won, full oft time he had the board begun. Above all nations in Pruss, in Litau, had he rised, and in Rus, no Christian man so ofte of his degree. In Granada, at the sage Eke, had he bay of Algiers, and Reden in Belmarais, at Lias was he, and the Sataleia, when they were won, and in the great say, at Minia noble arrive, had he bay. At mortal battles had he been 15, and foughten for our faith at Tramesine, in listas threes, and I slain his foe. This ilka worthy knight had been also some team with the Lord of Palitea. Again another heathen in Turkey, and evermore he had a sovereign priest, and though that he were worthy, he was wise. And of his port as make as the maid, he never yet no villainy nor said, in all his life unto no manner wicked. He was a fiery, perfect, gentle knight. But for to telling you of his array, his horse were gold, but he was not gay. Of fustian he weared a jipoon, all besmuttered with his habergeon, for he was latter come from his voyage, and went for to don his pilgrimage. Okay, some things to notice here. He seems to have been everywhere in the known world, both in Christendom and, as Chaucer tells us, in Hethenesse, in the heathen or non-Christian lands. This is lands dominated by Islam, by Muslims, mainly, and when he was on crusades against Muslims. Number two, he has street cred. He's well known everywhere. He's well known for all the right reasons. He's been in 15 mortal battles, competitions fought to the death. 3 times he's fought in listas, which were probably specific kinds of tournaments for jousting, perhaps, maybe sword fighting, and in each of those cases he slew his opponent. He killed his opponent each time. He has a high and widely known reputation, so he carries great gravity in this poem and as a character in this poem. But at the same time, the narrator describes him as being humble and understated. For example, his horse war good, but he was not gay. Meaning, he had a good horse, but he's not outfitting him like he's putting himself on conspicuous display. He doesn't dress to draw notice to himself. Absolutely my favorite element in this description is the description of his jipun, a tunic of heavy wool that he would have worn underneath his chainmail and his armor, and the narrator describes it as a fustian. He weared a jipun all besmattered with his habergeon, for he was late come from his voyage and went for to don his pilgrimage. His jipun underneath his chainmail is stained from the rust of his chainmail on top of it. Just a very humble kind of appearance. He doesn't even take the time to clean his clothing. He's going to go right on pilgrimage, coming back from his battle. With the knight is the squire, which is his son, and his son is 20 years old, and I think it described in a very interesting way. His son is a squire, meaning this is a specific type of role. He's a knight in training. He's preparing to become a knight, so he's in physical training. It took a long time to become physically trained to do what the knight does. And this is his son. With him there was his son, a young squire, and by the way, I'm reading lines 79 through 100 if you want to follow along. I'm going to begin again. With him there was his son, a young squire, a loafer and a lusty bachelor, with luckus crull as they were Leiden press, of 20 year of age he was, I guess. Of his stature he was of even length, and wonderly deliverer, and of great strength. And he had been sometime in Chevauchea, in Flanders, in Artois, and Picardia, and borne him well as of so little space, and hoped to stand in his lady grace. Embrooded was he as it were a maid, all full of fresh flowers, wheat and red. Singing he was of or floating all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, with sleeves long and wide. Well could he sit on horse and fiery reed. He could song a smakke, and well indeed. Justa and aike danse, and well portreie and rite. So had he loved that by Nictortala he slept no more than doth a Nickengala. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved before his father at the table. Okay, some things to notice. We have a generation gap here between father and son. The dominant color palette of the knight is gray, understated, maybe even boring. The narrator describes the squire, as, by contrast, as embroidered with color. As if he were a meadow full of white and red flowers. Like a whole meadow of white and red flowers. This is a fecund image. It's a moist, optimistic, fresh image. The night, cool colors, understated, even kind of cold colors. but the squire is described as being hot, right? He's young. The narrator guesses that he is 20 year of age in line 82. He's outgrown puberty. And he is close to his physical prime, or he's becoming closer to his physical prime. Strong. He's described as well proportioned, and he's entered a sexually assertive stage in life. He's described as hot, so hotly he loved. He practices chivalry. This is a medieval subculture in which women, usually married women who are beyond one's literal reach, become objects of extreme veneration, if not worship. And so it seems that the culture of chivalry allows a squire to display his ardent attraction openly and publicly for his ladi grassa. He sings, he dances, he sketches pictures, he writes poetry well, we're told. And he's flirting all the day. He's playing on a flute all day long. He wears his emotions outwardly as this sort of exudes from his body. And to me, most curiously, the narrator tells us, so hotly he loafed, that beneath gala at night he slept no more than doth a nightingale. In the medieval belief was that the nightingale didn't sleep, or because it never shuts its eyes, people didn't think it slept, and so this young knight doesn't get much sleep. I don't want to assume that the squire is engaging in actual sexual intercourse every night, and that's why he doesn't get a lot of sleep. I don't think we should assume that, but what are the possibilities? What's interesting to me is that he's not on spring break. He acts like a college student on spring break, but he's on a pilgrimage, and second, he's with his father, and he's still attached to his father. What I think is intriguing is he's his own person. He seems to act in a way that makes him disregard what his father thinks. He doesn't seem to mind at all what his father might think of his behavior. Seems like there's a generation gap here. He's his own person, right? Next we have the prioress, the prioressa, and I'll describe her. If you want to read along, the prioress is described in lines 118 through 162 in the general prologue. She's described as a nun, a prioress, meaning she was the leader, or the functioning leader of a convent, and she's got a retinue of people with her, so she's kind of important. I'll begin reading here. There was also a nun, a prioressa, that our smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was put i Santa Loy, and she was cleped Madam Eglantina. Full well she sung the service divine, and tuned in her nose full samely, and French she spoke full fire and faitously, after the school of Stratford at the Bow. For French of Paris was to her uncono. At mate well ye talked was her withal. She laid no morsel from her lippes fall, ne wet her fingers in her sauce dape. Well could she carry a morsel and well keep, that no drop nor feel upon her breast. In courtesy was set full much her lest. Her overlip weeped she so klein, that in her cup there was no farthing sign of grace. When she drunken had her dropped,
full samely was her mate she walked, and secretly she was of great disport, and full pleasant and amiable port, and pined her to counterfeit chair of court, and to bane statelijk of manner, and to bane holden digne of reverence. But for to speak of her conscience, she was so charitable and so piteous, she would weep if that she saw a moose cooked in a trap. If it were dead or bled, of small hundes had she that she fed with roasted flesh or milk or roasted bread, but more wept she if all of them were dead, or if men smote it with a yard smerte, and all was conscience and tender heart, full samely her wimple pinched was, her nose traitus, her een graye as glass, her mouthful small and thereto soft and dried, but secretly she had a fair forehead, it was almost a span broad, I trow. For hardly she was not undergrow, full fetters was her cloak, as he was war, of small corder boot her arm she bar, a pair of bedes, goaded all with grain, and thereon hang a brooch of gold full snane, on which there was first written a crowned eye, and after a more Vincent omnie. Some things to note about the prioress. Perhaps the most interesting character that Chaucer gives us in the Canterbury Tales, maybe the most interesting characters he gives us are morally ambiguous. Chaucer gives us he gives creative writers a lesson in how to keep readers off guard. He provides so many minute details that we tend to judge some of these characters very hesitantly. We may cross up our expectations. He crosses up our expectations. For example, if we expect the kind of knight we see portrayed in these very expensive movies or films, we might expect a knight with a mere, clean set of armor. Someone who looks as impressive as his reputation. We don't get that with the knight. Chaucer paints him as somewhat boring in appearance, not outwardly showy, right? With the prioress, we have almost a moral reversal of the knight. The speaker gives us so much detail about how hard she tries to appear clean, holy, dignified. She tries so hard that the overall effect makes her look vain or conceited or overly concerned about her appearance or her outward show, right? It sort of belies what she's attempting to portray about herself. Chaucer gives us 10 full lines describing how Madame Eglantina eats her food and drinks her wine. Lines 127 through 137. Why is this important? Because we need to consider that by one account, the fork, we eat with forks, right? The fork was not introduced in England for another 200 years after the characters in this poem are being portrayed. Probably about 1611 was when someone from England introduces England to the fork, which he brought from Italy. This is the late 1300s, and people ate everything but soup with their hands, right? So, Madame Eglantina, maybe very much a freak of her culture, considering that probably most people are wearing what they ate for dinner around on themselves, on their clothing and their beards, etc., because they're eating with their hands, right? We should also make note of all these characters, their size, the shape of their bodies, and their size of their bodies, and their skin complexion. Chaucer is making sure to describe what their skin looks like. Madame Eglantine's skin is described as fair. She has a fair forehead, We see only her forehead because she's probably wearing a wimple. It's covering her face. And so that's the skin on her body that the narrator can see. Described as fair, white. She's not going to have red skin like other characters. She's going to have white skin. We're told that the prioress, that secretly she was of great disport. She was of good cheer, right? Line 137. And full plaisant and amiable port. But, the speaker adds, and pined her to counterfeit the chair. Line 139. This is one of those dangerous lines that we can easily misinterpret if we're not careful, because the way the line looks to us makes it look like she took pains to avoid the appearance of cheerfulness. Okay? But the editors of the Northern Anthology actually gloss that line as she took pains to always pretend to be cheerful. She took pains to always appear cheerful, right? The first 9 lines of her description display her as showy, but this one very clever line, when we get to it, strongly suggests that she's an actor playing a role successfully. What dominates the prioress's personality is really cool control. No red complexion to suggest a real or genuine sanguine humor. The other characters who are red-faced, laughing, sanguine, optimistic humor. What we have with the prioress is this cool, controlled character. More important, pay attention to how large or skinny characters are. Chaucer describes the forms, the shapes of characters' bodies. The squire is described as a word meaning well proportioned. He's neither fat nor skinny. He describes this in the way that the Aristotelian theologian Aquinas, who also lived in the 13th century, speculated that a person's soul is manifested in the outward shape of their bodies. Or maybe more radically, the soul is the visual form of one's body. The soul is the visual form of one's body. The skin or the complexion indicates a person's psychological disposition as the outward sign of a person's dominant humors. You see this word humor. A humor is a liquid. It's the liquid that dominates one's body. In Chaucer's time, people believed that everything was composed of 4 primary atomic elements that are intermixed together in various proportions. There was air, an air element which was moist. There was an earth element which was considered dry, a fire element that was hot, and a water element that was considered cold. That's where cold comes from. The humors were different liquids in the body composed of a combination of these elements. And if you have, so for example, if you have a melancholy humor, you're dominated by a humor that is cold and dry, and your diagnosis dominated by black bile. The word bilious comes from this belief that a person who's melancholic is bilious, dominated by black bile. If you're sanguine, we use the word sanguine to mean optimistic, but sanguine is literal reference to blood. So if you're dominated by blood or the sanguine humor, you were considered an optimistic, cheerful person. If you were choleric, angry, irritable, you had a hot and dry humor. You were likely to catch fire, lose your temper, become angry very easily. If you're phlegmatic, the root word phlegmatic is phlegm, and phlegm was considered the dominant humor. You're dominated by a cold, moist humor. You're tired, lethargic. You have a hard time getting up in the morning. You're dominated by phlegm. When you read Chaucer's descriptions of each character, think of their skin complexion as their dominant humor attempting to escape their bodies. So when he's describing the skin, what you want to imagine is the kind of person, their personalities beyond their conscious and deliberate control are pushing outward on their skin, attempting to escape their bodies. And so you get a really good clue about how Chaucer thought of these characters' internal psychological lives by their skin complexion. So if you've got acne or sores or something like that, it's an indication of some sort of like hot humor trying to escape the body. Notice that the narrator describes the prioress as hardily she was not underground, line 156, or assuredly she was not underground. She was of very good size. Most assuredly she was not underground. If Chaucer makes characters large, especially fat, it is significant. It means that he or she have access to food or nutrition that the skinny characters do not have. The question I think the work presents to us implicitly is, do they deserve more food or nutrition than the other characters? There's a conflict, there's a moral conflict between their bodies, which might display a conspicuous nutritional habit. They have access to resources that other people don't, and their moral outlook, which might suggest that they exploit other people in order to get those extra resources. So there's very much a socialist element in this poem, asking us, do they deserve resources? They deserve to be that large, right? Do they deserve it more than others? Thank you so much for watching this instructional video. If it was helpful, please let me know. If it was not, and you still have questions, or you just want to discuss anything I talked about, feel free to email me at slong2@central.uh.edu. Again, thank you, and have a happy and healthy day.